The Calamity Mod is by far my favorite mod for Terraria, which is already one of my favorite games, and with that being said, I decided to take a bit of time to play every single class, from the very start to the very end, entirely in death mode and to document my experiences. This statement isn't entirely true, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but first I'll explain some things. I'd like to note that this video is mostly for me and to document my own experiences playing the game, as a time capsule of what the mod felt like, what I enjoy about it the most, and how my taste can change with time. Secondly, a good 3/4 of the game footage you're about to see is going to be me playing through my mage playthrough, which was at the time when I decided it would be fun to document my experience. I've recorded the full Supreme Witch fights for all the classes though, so you shouldn't be worried. Calamity Mod being one of the best additions of content any game mod can offer is a statement I'll wear proudly honestly. And with that being said, there were many reasons for me to embark on this journey. There really isn't a main reason as to why I decided to play through all the classes, but a large portion is because I wanted to experience the soundtrack to its full extent. Last time I properly played through the Calamity Mod was a little while ago, before a lot of the additional music was added by Heart Plus Up. For those who don't know, the original composer for almost all of the Calamity Mod soundtrack was produced by DM DOKURO, which worked on countless pieces for the game. Unfortunately, DM DOKURO received too much harassment from the fans, and he decided to step down for his own mental health. Thankfully though, Heart Plus Up has done amazing work recently with the new soundtracks, and after playing through the game a few times, I got to listen to all the work they've put in. One of the tracks you're currently listening to is made by them, and I've put their work in the description if you're interested in listening to more of their songs. Not only did I want to experience the new tracks in the mod, I've also been doing my own composing recently for a fairly large project that I'm working on. Listening to a bunch of music for different atmospheres and biomes and arenas, hint hint, and such has been super useful, and I don't have much news about it right now. But I will let you guys know that the rest of the music you'll hear in this video will be entirely mine and composed by me. Links to those will also be in the description if you're interested. Now, some of my favorite tracks from the Calamity Mod are Siren's theme for Anahita. This one is played before the boss fight, when you first meet the Leviathan or whatever. I also like the Slime God's theme. Funny enough, there was actually a bug when I was playing where the boss fight ended early, and although the slimes were still alive, I ended up getting the treasure bag from the ball that kept flying around. I also liked Cryogen's theme. This was also DM DOKURO's first song created for the Calamity Mod. Also the Sulphurous Sea biome during the nighttime, which is the one that's currently playing, which is also in the description. Last time I played through the Calamity Mod, the interludes were planned to be implemented, and they turned out to be great tracks as well. Before I get into my opinion and experience in the technical stuff, I do have to mention a few things, and that is that I lied. I originally planned to do this playthrough entirely in death mode, but I unfortunately had to turn the difficulty down to Revengeance mode for the Devourer of Gods fight. I really tried to do it on all my playthroughs, but I came to the conclusion that I'm just not that good, and I don't really have the patience to make a large enough arena. And especially with every class currently, it's just very tedious to do. Maybe another day, but not today. This was also done mainly because it is by far one of my least favorite boss fights in the Calamity Mod. That might be a quite controversial opinion, but I'm happy to see it getting reworked in the future. I also didn't really want to do the exo-mechs, and I mean that leads to the boss rush too, so I guess that is something I didn't end up doing, but it's mainly because I still need to learn the exo-mechs to beat them, and I guess that's what I need to do the boss rush properly. So to begin on some of the gameplay elements, my favorite class to play was surprisingly melee. For context, I did the entirety of pre-hard mode, completely true melee. After the Wall of Flesh, I kind of skipped true melee, pretty much the entirety of hard mode because I didn't think it was worth it at the time. At the time, the bosses did too much damage for me, and I honestly couldn't keep up, especially with Cryogen and Skeletron Prime. However, I did do Moonlord entirely in True Melee, as well as some bosses after that. I'll list them here so you can check. In vanilla and in past playthroughs, Summoner was actually my favorite, and to see it change was surprising to me considering I don't really like melee in vanilla Terraria, but I think one of the main reasons behind this is because in both vanilla and Calamity, the melee class is kind of just the poster boy, and it receives the most love out of all the classes. A lot of the weapons built off the last one, and it kind of just came all together to feel like I was using something that I worked hard for, and the melee weapons were all super fun to use. The only complaint I have is the rework to the hammers, such as the Stellar Contempt. That one is the one that comes to mind because it was my favorite, but that kind of a line of hammers that leads up to it, the Ponage Hammer, they got reworked. I don't know if it was recently or not, but they functioned similar to the Paladin's Hammer, but now they're a projectile, and they charge up the more you hit, and then it also just like has a giant charge attack that you use. Also, the Warbanner of the Sun is genuinely the coolest looking accessory in the game, and no one can change my opinion. All classes, I mean, I genuinely enjoyed them for the most part. They were all pretty fun, but I'll get to the ones that I liked the least. And last, for my favorite class, I guess the least favorite you could say, was surprisingly Mage. Going into this, I honestly thought it was going to be ranged because, in my opinion, the weapons were bland, but it was honestly me at that point. A lot of the times I would use stuff like guns, and I never really saw myself using bows or launchers. This playthrough, I decided to use bows and launchers quite a bit, and I found myself enjoying it quite often actually. But I don't know what it is about Mage. I can't really get around it, but it's just not my class. Mage has the most diverse weapon list, since there's a lot you can do with magic as a concept, but I don't really like the mana mechanic. I think it's mainly because managing your mana is a bit tedious, and you're punished for wasting your attacks or using mana potions, which I don't really like. Even with the base mana regeneration being increased, the armor and weapon designs for Mage are some of my favorites for armor sets in Calamity though. In terms of easiest class to use, honestly, it depends. I'd have to go with early game, I'd say Summoner, and then towards the later parts of the game, I'd say Rogue. Summoner is by far the most aggressive class in terms of damage early on, and although it plateaus a bit when you get to mid-game and into hard mode, it's at a time when you get comfortable with good accessories and proper movement, such as, you know, you get wings, you get an increased dash speed, you get, you know, better hooks, whatnot, and you feel much more free in your movement. Late game though would hands down go to Rogue. I mean, there were times where I was fighting Supreme Witch and I just one-shot phases of her because I stealth stroke. That's kind of a sus. Okay. I used a stealth strike and rage at the same time, or adrenaline. And on top of that, rogue accessories, they honestly do too much. Like damage reduction, healing, extra damage, you know, like invincibility. I think having all that is a little bit excessive for one class, especially one accessory. There was a time, I think, in the Supreme Witch fight where I got hit maybe like 3-4 times in a row, and I only lost maybe 250 HP. And I mean, usually you'd get punished a lot more for other classes. But I think it was, with the Eclipse Mirror, it was just normal for me. The hardest class, I mean, even with true melee aside, would probably have to be melee. Early game gives you very little options for safe attacks, so you're pretty much forced to do true melee for a portion of pre-hard mode. You're not very tanky or powerful either during those times, so I mean, get ready to master attack patterns. True melee though was the most fun I've had in Calamity Mod, honestly. Until I had to stop due to the huge skill gap hard mode brought, I honestly really enjoyed it. Finally beating Moonlord in true melee was the most memorable moment I've had in the Calamity Mod during these playthroughs though. Past that, melee's damage was quite lacking throughout the playthrough. I mean, respectably so. I knew going into this playthrough that melee would have lower damage than most classes, and it was met pretty fairly with how my expectations were set. My favorite bosses to fight in death mode were probably Cryogen and the Desert Scourge. Cryogen is honestly, in my opinion, your first introduction to a bullet hell boss, and the sound design, the concept, the soundtrack, and also the aurora in the background all make Cryogen like one of the best bosses of all time. The fight feels fair mainly because I don't think any of the patterns overlap poorly. They all have their own unique style to them, and they're fairly easy to dodge if you memorize their attacks. And on top of that, it's also where you get the Kelvin Catalyst, which is like your rogue weapon for the next 10 bosses. The Desert Scourge is, in my opinion, the perfect beginning boss. Not only is it a tame introduction of getting punished in death mode, but nothing feels annoying to learn, and the boss lets you use the weapons you acquired to their full potential. I mean, especially for a worm boss that doesn't split and overwhelm you when you damage it. Also, one thing to note about that, all these playthroughs were Crimson, because although the Corrupted soundtrack is amazing, I honestly can't stand the Eater Worlds and would much rather fight the Brain of Cthulhu. Now onto the bosses I dislike. There's not one boss I hate more in Calamity Mod. Actually, hate's a strong word. I'd say dislike, and that is Skeletron Prime. In death mode, that boss is, bar none, the most annoying boss I think I've ever faced in Calamity Mod. I think on every playthrough, I died more times on him than everywhere else combined in the playthroughs of each class. I don't really know if it's my movement being like subpar or my flight pattern being bad, but I genuinely couldn't stand our Linus boss when I fought him. I think a way to improve it is have some delay between the skulls and the laser wheel, where he kind of just charges at you and makes that wheel of lasers. I think the transition between those needs to be a little bit bigger, because there are situations I'm put in where I can't really dodge both phases at once because they're so close together. The other mechanical bosses were completely fine. I actually like the AI of the mechanical bosses. It's just Skeletron Prime that I have a small issue with. But in second place for my least favorite boss would probably be the Devourer of Gods. Honestly, this might be a hot take, but there's not much to say in terms of this boss fight. I don't think a boss fight in this style should be in Terraria. I think the worm is, in my opinion, too big, and it leaves the player getting squished sometimes, especially in a period of the game where your movement is extremely fast and freeing. I just find it very uncomfortable. That on top of the laser walls being a bit unfair and overwhelming, especially when you get caught on a bad phase of the boss where he's aggressive and you come into the laser wall, with either getting hit by him or the lasers is kind of just unlucky. But I think the upcoming rework to the Devourer of Gods, especially with the resprite coming out, can make some really nice changes. So I guess that's it for most of the technical stuff. I do want to show you guys some stuff, especially my houses. Obviously I got pretty creative in some of them. I went with a different biome for each class. My rogue was in the forest, my summoner was in the desert, my melee was in the snow, my ranged was in the jungle, and my magic playthrough was in the sky. I wanted to make it in the Hallowed, obviously, but I couldn't really start in the Hallowed because Hallowed came in hard mode, so I decided to go with the sky because it was very majestic. I'm not the most creative person, but I think I did pretty well in these builds. Next, I'm going to name some of my favorite accessories. These are mostly, I think, classless, and I'm just going to improv this. I've been following kind of a rubric or script for this, but I kind of just want to go off the top of my head on these. The first thing is the Abyssal Amulet. This can be found in any part of the game. Basically, all you have to really do is fish on the Sulphurous Sea surface, and it lets any attack you do have this certain debuff. I can't remember the name, but it's it just gives you a debuff, and the debuff is really good early on. I think I used this on 3 or 4 classes up until hard mode. It was really, really good. And the good thing is it's not a debuff where everything is like resistant to it. You know, you got like the fire, you get the poison. Those are very resistant to a lot of enemies that are resistant to it. But this is something where almost every enemy or boss can be affected by it, which was a really good DPS increase. Especially in the later games, it was probably half my damage on some of the bosses. Next up is the community. This is a fan favorite. It's one of my favorites, especially later in the game. It's probably on every single character if I check, but besides that, it's probably one of my favorite accessories I get at every single playthrough, and it basically just adds a bunch of stats to your person. And as well as that, later in the game, I use the Core of the Blood God. I believe this is from the Calamitous clone. Basically, you just get healing based on your defense damage you take, and basically, I find myself getting healed for half the damage bosses do to me. Especially in death mode, it can be very useful if they do a lot of armor damage to you and you have a lot of armor. Let's say you're using Warden on some accessories and you get an extra maybe like 10-20 defense. That equates to maybe 5 or 6 extra, obviously defense, but like you get defense, but also you get defense damage done, which is also extra healing for the core of the Blood God. I use this on the witch fights, and combined with the next accessory, it just makes me so much more tanky. That next accessory is called the Sponge. This one is like ridiculous. It was kind of slept on a long time ago when I played, and I didn't really use it because I didn't really play the harder modes. Now that I'm getting into Revengeance and Death mode, I find the Sponge to be super useful. A lot of the times, if I'm dodging and playing well, obviously in a boss fight, I don't get hit for more than, you know, a 10-second interval, and by the time I get hit, the Sponge is already up, and the Sponge just takes all my damage. And the best thing about this is, if I take damage with the Sponge active, my adrenaline I think stays up, so that was really good for especially Rogue 2 with the Eclipse Mirror. I basically had adrenaline every 3 seconds. So yeah, those were some good accessories I recommend in your playthroughs. They're really useful and they can really be used for honestly any class. Any class will benefit from them and they'll really help you. For some good weapons, I'm going to go through chronological order in terms of when I found them and when I used them. So first, I did Rogue. The Shattered Sun is one of the best ones. I believe this is post-Providence, and it's the crystalline crafting tree. It's an upgraded variant of the crystalline. You get that very early on, I think pre-boss, and you just upgrade it throughout the game. The Shattered Sun, I think, is the final version of it, and it's very, very satisfying to use, and it does a lot of damage, which is very nice. The Old Reaper is also very nice. It's very easy to use. You can just like throw it and focus on dodging, and it'll just do the damage for you. The damage isn't like super high, but that comes at the cost of an ease of use, like a weapon that's very easy to use. You get it from, I think it's a 10% drop from Old Duke, but I'm not entirely sure. And then for Rogue, ending it off is the Seared Pan. I used this against the Supreme Witch, and I just like pieced it up. I actually like jumped that fool. For melee, I honestly have to give props to the Astral Blade. That's what I used to kill the Moonlord in true melee, and honestly, it's like ridiculous. I probably would have got more DPS out of it if I used it against Providence compared to using the Stellar Striker, but the Stellar Striker was just more easier to use. Next up on melee, we have the Teratomir. The rework to this weapon actually made it super fun to use. I actually really loved it, especially for Duke Fishron. It made it act like such a breeze. And then moving on to ranged, we have this Scorched Earth. I'm not a big fan of launchers, but this one, there was something about the Scorched Earth that drew me towards it. It was just like such a satisfying weapon. I was playing with launchers quite often towards the end of the game, and things like the Starmada, the Starmageddon, I honestly didn't really like. I ended up picking up the Scorched Earth, and it was like, it's like that one ergonomic mouse that like fits your palm perfectly. That's just how it felt holding that gun. And like surprisingly, for it being a weapon you get before Yaren, I used it to kill Supreme Witch, which was quite nice. And then for Mage, this one's a little bit earlier in the playthrough. This is the Gleaming Magnolia. This is the Mana Rose crafting tree. I believe it's the one post mechanical bosses before Plantera. You're probably seeing footage of me killing Plantera with it. But that was probably one of my favorite weapons to use, mainly because it was super satisfying and easy to use. You know, it's a giant flower you use to kill people with. It's great. But yeah, it was just a super satisfying weapon to use. And then after that, post Moonlord, we get the Nuclear Fury. This thing decimated the Profane Guardians. It decimated the Dragon Folly. And honestly, it was my, what's the word? my Knight in Shining Armor to the Ceaseless Void, which is like one of my least favorite bosses. That's mainly just because I don't know the boss. Yeah, the Nuclear Fury is actually kind of nuts. Guess that does it. Purpose to all of this, before the next changes get released, such as the Devour of Gods rework, the Wolfram, and the Draydon changes, I plan on attempting a hardcore run of the Calamity Mod. The good thing about playing through the game with all the classes is that I guess I finally know what class would be best to do a hardcore run from start to finish. Now I don't think I'll do Death Mode, but I'll probably end up doing Revengeance Mode, seeing as it's a step down from what I usually play on, and it still poses a challenge for me. The class I choose, well, you'll find out when I finish. For those of you still watching, thank you for sitting through me sharing my experiences, and I want to personally thank the community of the Calamity Mod and the Calamity Mod development team for their hard work on such an amazing mod. Of course, ratings on the video help me determine what you guys like or dislike, and feel free to share with the homies if you want, of course. That's it for me, and I'll talk to you guys later.